Doing?
All right, we're recording. Take it away.
All right. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this week's Geospatial Forum through the Center for Geospatial Analytics at NC State. My name is Rachel Kasten. I am a University Program Associate here with the Center. So welcome everybody who is able to join us. We've got a mix of people joining us from all over and also some small groups gathered throughout the center and some of our labs there to have some viewing parties. So it is great to see everybody. And I am going to welcome our guest speaker, Catherine D'Ignazio. Catherine D'Ignazio is an assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT. She's also director of the Data plus Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. D'Ignazio is a scholar, artist/designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. With Raul Bargueva, she built the platform databasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. Her 2020 book from MIT Press, Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren F. Klein, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. Her research at the intersection of technology, design, and social justice has been published in Science and Engineering Ethics, the Journal of Community Informatics, and the Proceedings of Human Factors in Computing Systems and Computer-Supported Cooperative Work in Social Computing. Her art and design projects have won awards and been exhibited at the Venice Biennial and the ICA Boston. I'm going to let Catherine take it away, and then we are going to have some time for Q&A at the end.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, John. Thanks to everyone at NC State for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all, and thank you for the great turnout. So let me, I think one of you has to make me a co-host so that I can share my screen, actually. There we go. All right, 1 minute. Great. So I am going to talk with you today in our brief time together about data feminism and mapping. And just so you know, oh wait, no, I can pull up the chat. I actually love encouraging an active chat, but I can't always pay attention to it as I'm talking. But I would welcome folks to be posting resources and links and questions in the chat as I'm talking. Mainly today, I'm going to be talking about our book, Data Feminism. This is a book that I published last year with Lauren Klein. And so Rachel did a really nice introduction of me, but Lauren is an associate professor of English and quantitative theory and methods at Emory University in Atlanta. And then she also directs a lab called the Digital Humanities Lab. And so her background and training is really as a literary scholar, historian, early American period, early Americanist scholar. And so, yeah, we came together across our different kind of disciplinary and practitioner backgrounds to come together to write Data Feminism. And so what I'm going to do today, I want to explain a little bit about our motivations for writing the book. I also want to explain what we mean by the feminism part of data feminism. One of the things we found is that people come to that word with lots of different, they bring lots of different things into that word. So we like to be really specific about which feminism we are talking about with that word. And then I'm going to show you some of the examples of sort of feminist data practices that we talk about in the book. And I wanted to try to focus on maths and mapping, given the context that you all are in. And then I wanted to just break it down even a little bit more succinctly and pragmatically. I am a very pragmatic person, and I like very specific, I don't know, tips and tools and things like that. So at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit how I teach the GIS class for our Department of Urban Planning. And so I'm going to talk a little bit how we've been bringing the data feminism principles into our teaching of GIS and spatial analysis to sort of like ground us a little bit and like how we might adapt data feminism in a really kind of specific context. Oh, and the one last thing I'll say about this slide, just to note that Data Feminism, the book is open access. So if you go to the website that's listed here, you'll see a link that says read the book, and you click on that, and that'll take you to the open access version. So it's free and open online. So to get started, Lauren and I really see data feminism as part of a growing body of work. And it's work that is working to hold corporate and government actors accountable for basically making sexist, racist, classist data products. So these are things like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, and so on. And almost every day, there's like some new example in the popular press of like this or this algorithm, this or this, device discriminates against this or this class of people. And often the way that these examples are reported in the popular press is like, it continues. I mean, honestly, like the press has been reporting about this for now a really long time, but it's like always like, like throw up the hands, like, how could an algorithm be racist? How could an algorithm be sexist? Like, how's this possible? And so it's a way like Lauren and I coming together and wanting to think about, well, like, what are, how do we have a conversation that's like not starting at this like shock and surprise every single time? Because actually these things are like entirely predictable. And then also, we wanted to counteract, I guess would say, like a lot of the prevailing narratives, that what you might call the techno-heroic narratives about data. And you can see an example of, I think, one of the most prominent of these at the top of this slide. So this idea that data is the new oil. This is probably all of you are people working with data. You have probably heard something along these lines. We think about this as a meme, actually. So this is actually something that comes out in late 2000s. It's a meme that's kind of boosted by The Economist magazine in the early 2010s. And it's mainly, if you think about it, it's using the metaphor of oil, but sort of in what sense? In the sense that oil is an untapped natural resource. It can lead to profit once it has been extracted, mined, refined, processed, cleaned, and so on. And so you can see that like actually many of the metaphors that we use to work with data they're metaphors of extraction, and they're very similar actually to oil. But what The Economist and the related folks who are using the new data is the new oil meme are talking about is also that data can lead to great profit. However, women, and in particularly Black and Indigenous women and women of color, as well as Indigenous people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more, experience this very same process of data extraction as just the same old oppression. So in fact, instead of sort of leading us all to these great untold riches in the future, what in fact is happening with our data-driven systems are that we are accelerating and exacerbating many of the same durable structural inequalities that have existed for a very long time. So things like racism, sexism, colonialism, and more. And we are not the first ones to make the case that this idea that data is the same old oppression. And in fact, we list here at the bottom of the slide, there's a bunch of examples that were very inspirational for us as we were writing the book. There's a really wonderful, I think, new field of study emerging called critical data studies, which accompanies earlier efforts like critical geography, critical cartography, feminist geography, feminist STS, like there's lots of prior work in this space. But for us, what we felt like we could bring into this conversation is to explain how feminism, and in particular intersectional feminism, has a lot to offer this conversation. Because if we want to talk about mitigating deep-seated inequality, so first of all, both recognizing deep-seated inequality in the world and then mitigating, challenging, and dismantling it, feminism has a lot to say. So there's lots of useful things that we can bring in here. So we like to ground folks though in what definition of feminism and what lineage of feminism that we are drawing from. And so we like to talk about three things that feminism is. So first of all, feminism is a belief. And it's a very simple belief. It's a belief in equality and equal rights for all genders. And so if that's a thing that you believe, that is a feminist belief, and you are a feminist. I mean, you don't have to identify yourself that way, but that is the basic underlying tenet of feminism. But so if you believe that all genders are equal, then all you have to do is look around you in the world, and you have to see that we haven't realized the world in which all genders are equal. We still live within a system of gendered power relations. And so what feminism implies is also a commitment to political action to realize the world in which all genders are equal. So it's a belief, it's political action. And then finally, and thirdly, something that I find very exciting, feminism is an intellectual heritage. And so it's a set of theories and ideas that we inherit, and that we inherit them from many disciplines. In fact, a wide range of disciplines has feminist work within it. Sometimes it's very niche and a little bit hidden in those disciplines, and hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, but many disciplines have feminist work. And it's a set of theories and ideas that help us both, sort of recognize, understand, and challenge unequal power in the world. And, the reason I find this so exciting is that it means we don't have to invent these things. Like, there's many people who have come before us that have studied inequality, gendered inequality and racial inequality and so on, and we can draw from them. They don't have to have talked about data science necessarily, but we can draw from them in order to bring their ideas into relationship to some of the challenges that we face today. But what is intersectional feminism specifically? Because that's the definition of feminism that we ground the book in. And we say in the book actually that feminism in the year 2021 really needs to be understood as intersectional. And so you all, I'm not sure sort of where folks are coming from on this call. You may or may not be familiar with this term. Intersectionality is a sort of metaphor that was outlined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. And she uses this metaphor of the intersection. It's a spatial metaphor, in fact. She uses this to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, such as gender. So if we're talking about inequality or oppression, we have to talk about the intersection of the forces and factors that produce it, racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. And the key thing to understand about intersectionality, which is something that's sometimes overlooked when people use it sort of casually, is it's not just describing individual markers of identity. It's really not a theory of identity. So it's not just that, like, I am cisgender, I'm a woman, I am white. That's not intersectionality in itself. it actually is describing the structural forces of power and their intersections that combine and create these effects for groups of people, not only individuals. Meaning, what does it look like? And originally, what Crenshaw was theorizing is like the specific experiences of Black women who face specifically racism and sexism combined, such that we can't, like, just an analysis of gender doesn't help us explain the challenges that Black women were facing, and in particular, in this particular legal case that she outlined. And so what Crenshaw would say is sort of its intersectionality is kind of framework against a single axis of oppression, or like using a single variable to explain everything, right? It's really advocating for a more complex, nuanced and multi-factor kind of analysis of inequality. And I just want to note here that it is the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have really foregrounded this conversation. And so Crenshaw sort of makes this metaphor of intersectionality, but actually she follows in a really long line of Black feminist thinkers who have, in a sense, always theorized these forces of oppression as intersecting, or as the Combahee River Collective said, they're interlocking. And so she's sort of following in a long lineage. But so if we take this seriously, like we say intersectionality, more than just gender, multiple forces of oppression, this leads us to some pretty powerful things. So what this means then is that intersectional feminism is not only about women, it is also not only about gender, it is actually about power. So who has power and who does not have power. And in today's world, data is power. I mean, it's like power in a very material way. Like we can think back to that quote about data is the new oil, right? If we think about like who are the companies that are on top, that are making the most money, they're the companies that have the ability to collect, store, analyze, maintain, deploy, utilize data and sort of data-driven products. And so intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help us challenge and change that power. So as you know, in the process of writing the book, we did a kind of scan of feminist literature and writing. We drew on our own prior knowledge of these spaces as well. We looked in particular at fields where folks had tried to draw feminist theory into a kind of a making process or a design process. So we looked, for example, at feminist and critical cartography. We looked at feminist human-computer interaction, feminist legal scholarship. We're trying to like, how do we make feminist laws, feminist economics? Like there's many of these worlds where folks have tried to kind of mobilize what is like a feminist approach specifically look like. And we tried to draw from that literature to understand, like, so what does data science look like? And we really tried to operationalize what we learned from intersectional feminism. What are the implications for data science? Like, how do we do it differently? And what do we do differently? And so on. And so our goal, was really to operationalize feminism for data science. So to provide a model for people who are already working with data, who want to work with data, or even people who want to refuse to work with data on, some kind of political grounds. And so this is actually, these are the principles that we came up with from that scan. There's 7 principles of data feminism. It's also maybe important to say this is actually how the book is structured. So like it goes principle by principle, chapter 1 through 7. What we try to do in the book is we try not to assume any prior knowledge of either data or feminism. And so in each chapter, we introduce the reader to some of the feminist thinkers that led us to formulate that principle. And then we also introduce folks to some of the people who are actually working on, whose work sort of embodies that principle, who's like they're actually doing work that embodies this principle of examining power or embracing pluralism. And so we have lots of examples in the book, partially as a way of showing like, hey, this is possible. Like this is not some pie in the sky sort of vision. This is already happening. And so I'm not going to have time to go through all of these today, but I'll just draw your attention to the first two principles here are examine power and challenge power. And if you think back to that definition of feminism that I just gave you being about power, this is sort of where these come from. And this is really at the heart of the feminist project. So often we'll get asked questions like, how is this, how is your, program you're proposing, how is this different from just doing good data science? And this is the answer to that question. It's this feminist imperative to examine power and to challenge power. And at least so far in sort of more mainstream data science, it is not mainstreamed yet to examine power and challenge power. I would love that would be wonderful if that becomes the mainstream, but for the moment, that's sort of the kernel of the feminist project, is to specifically look at ways in which these, data sets, processes, methods, systems can reinscribe existing structural inequalities, but also ways that data science can challenge existing structural inequalities. Okay, so I want to show you all a couple of examples that come, that illustrate some of these principles and that come from the book. So this one has to do with this very first principle, examine power. And in this chapter, we talk about projects like Mimi Onuoha's Library of Missing Data Sets. And so this is a term that was coined by Onuoha to describe data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing need. But for various reasons, these data sets don't exist. So these are things, and she actually collects the data sets that don't exist. She names them and collects them. So there are things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. Or even, I think, just how difficult it was, especially during the earlier days of COVID, but continuing in the later days of COVID still, actually, because the data management kept changing, how a gender and race breakdown of people with COVID in different places was really challenging, and sort of where that data was being made available and by whom. And so Onuoha exhibits this. So this is actually an art project. So she has this list, and then she actually exhibits this as this white filing cabinet that you see here. And then each data set that does not exist has this little file folder entry, and it has a typed name of the data that are not there. And then of course, as you're the viewer, you can like interact with this art piece, and you like open the folder, and of course nothing's in the folder because we actually have no records about that particular phenomena in the world. And so the reason though, and Onuoha writes really amazingly about sort of why they're empty. And the reason she points to is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. Data are not cheap, data take resources. And those resources and who has those resources determine which data are collected and which data are not collected. Governments have the power to do this. Moneyed institutions have the power. All too often, minoritized groups do not have the power to collect their own data. And so this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power. And the power is like kind of way earlier in the pipeline than a lot of us have been talking about, at least. Like a lot of that press stuff that I was talking about is like focuses on biased algorithms or biased data sets. And that is really important work. And I'm glad we're talking about those things. But we also need to recognize that the bias comes earlier in the process when we even determine what data are worthy of collecting and which data are not. Because all too often then that determines what can be done later on in later stages. So this next example, this is from the second chapter, which is about this principle of challenging power. This is another case of missing data sets. But in this case, the data are related to the phenomenon of feminicide. And so for those of you who are not familiar with that concept, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They have recently been in the news. If you were following the Gabby Petito case, that was a very clear instance of feminicide, a gender-motivated killing. And there was also a real critical conversation happening around sort of the imbalance of media coverage of the Gabby Petito case versus the many missing and murdered Indigenous women that go uncovered by the media. So feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They are legally defined as crimes in actually a lot of countries, and all Latin American countries at this point, they have a law criminalizing feminicide. However, despite the legal framework, the state does not systematically collect data on feminicide. So the fact that it doesn't, like the state sort of performatively passes a law, but doesn't actually implement its law or really even understand the scope and the scale of the problem. This is also the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. And so if you want to follow that, you can look at this hashtag ni una menos, which means not one less woman. Specifically because of the way in which, the state neglects to fully implement its own laws. And so we tell the story in the book of one woman named Maria Salguero, who was very frustrated by the lack of action and the lack of data. And so she basically headed straight towards the problem and started collecting the data herself. And this is back in 2015, 2016 timeframe. And so since she's been collecting now for 6 years, she has single-handedly compiled the largest public archive of feminicides in the Mexican context. And she does this using partially official data sources and then partially monitoring through the news media. So she will like manually be reading news stories like 2 to 4 hours a day and like copying and pasting into her database and into this map that you see here. She's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided her data to journalists and NGOs. She's actually been called in front of the Mexican Congress multiple times to testify. And in the book, we talk about this as what you might call a form of feminist counter data. And so this is, this idea of counter data is this kind of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic rights of their population, including the right to live, right? And there actually is a human right to live a life free of violence. And so this idea of counter data represents one way to use data to challenge power. Now, there's an important caveat, which is that it is not a given that in any given circumstance that collecting counter data is always like the right thing to do to address a social problem. And so I think here we just need to think about like what, there might be many cases in which documenting particularly a minoritized or marginalized population might render them visible to authorities in ways that might be harmful to them. So if you think about like, even with the best intentions, if you were going out and trying to catalog undocumented immigrants, say, in your location to provide them with services, there's a way in which those data might be incredibly harmful to them, shared with institutions that want to target and profile them. And so, it's like the idea there is like counter data is not going to save us in all cases, but it is a really interesting form of data activism, a way to challenge power with data. So in the book, we also talk about counter data collection efforts like the anti-eviction mapping project, which you can see here. This is another sort of counter data project. Since 2013, they have worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area and in other places as well, because they have chapters in many locations. So here on this map, each red dot indicates a place where a person or a family was evicted, and then the blue dots indicate places where the AEMP also interviewed one of the people who was evicted. So the blue dots are these interviews, they're more qualitative data. And if you click on the blue dot, and one of the interviews comes up and you can watch it, and that's what you see here on the right, Phyllis Bowie, who's a resident of Midtown. And in the chapter, we contrast the process that AEMP uses to collect their data with the work of Eviction Lab, which is based at Princeton University. And so the Eviction Lab's goal, I mean, ostensibly they're super similar, but just at a different scale, because the Eviction Lab's goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. A very worthy goal, I want to say. This is a valuable project. Particularly right now, it's really timely. But these two projects and these two maps are wildly different in terms of process. And so the Eviction Lab's maps derived from seemingly bigger data. The map presents a seemingly more comprehensive picture of the problem of eviction. However, the AEMP, working in their very local sort of grounded scale, has shown that national real estate databases, like the ones that Eviction Lab uses to draw from for their national picture, that these databases significantly undercount evictions. And so like they've actually, AEMP has actually done a comparison of, sort of just how they show that their data is significantly different from the data that these national databases have. And it's partially because they count differently. And so that's an important thing to note. But working instead with local communities and displaced people, AEMP has gathered a sort of messier, but much more accurate, ultimately like more complete data, as well as more contextualized data that documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And so this in this chapter about pluralism is what we say, what is gained by embracing pluralism. And it's really in line with this idea of a more participatory process for data science and for maps. So the previous examples have focused on sort of power and people, but another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power, and specifically binary structures. So like there's a lot of feminist theory that is about binaries, which you probably can guess has to do with the gender binary. So there's a lot of feminist work that is about engaging with this idea of the gender binary that we inherit. So we often, those of us who haven't gone to women, gender, sexuality studies classes, we kind of inherit this common sense idea that there are two genders, there's men and there's women. And that's how the world is, right? And so what feminist theorists would say, well, first of all, that's not, first of all, there's not two, right? Just like, first of all, like there's more than two genders. That's an empirical observation. Like if you say there's two genders, that's actually a false statement. And that has persisted across many cultures, histories, timeframes. There have always been more than two genders. So first of all, it's a false binary. But second of all, feminist theorists would say, well, also, this like common sense idea of gender binary, this is actually also hiding a hierarchy, right? Because it's not men and women and like they're equal. Actually, like it's like men are here and women are here, right? And so, that all of this leads kind of feminist theory to have a really deep suspicion of binaries in general. So like not only the gender binary, so the ways in which, things like the gender binary erases gender identity, and it also hides a hierarchy that's kind of sitting behind it as a kind of a data structure. And so like feminists have generalized that to other kinds of binaries to start to question those as well. And so like those are things like the distinction between nature and culture, or subject and object. Or the one that this next example takes up is the artificial distinction between reason on the one hand and emotion on the other hand. It's like another example of kind of a false binary. And so in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. So a lot of the best practices for data visualization involve a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, just the facts sort of approach to showing the numbers. But in the chapter on elevating emotion and embodiment, we question this. We say, like, why are these our best practices? You know, especially when researchers are starting to show the ways in which our visualization conventions communicate this sort of sense of objectivity. So there's some really interesting work here by Kennedy and other authors. And this work talks about how our focus on two-dimensional viewpoints, clean layouts, geometric shapes and lines, and data source inclusion work to communicate what you know, you could call truthiness or objectivity. This idea that there is no standpoint, this idea that things are neutral, that there's only reason present here, no emotion, folks, no opinions. But what about the opposite? So like, what about visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion? And that's what this next example helps us explore. So this is an interactive work. You can look at it online. This is actually screenshots of an animation. And so what this represents is the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in 2018. And the way this works is there's an arc that goes across the screen that represents a single person's life. Their life is represented as orange until the moment that they are killed, because on the x-axis is time axis. At a certain point in their lives, their life is cut short by gun violence, and then their arc turns gray. And so on the left, at the top left here, you see the statistic of the number of people that were killed. And then they compute this really interesting speculative statistic of how many years were stolen from these people, but also stolen from their families and their communities. And so this unfolds as an animation, and it's really overwhelming to watch. It's really almost unbearable. And that's kind of the point. Like, there are too many people being killed by guns in the United States. It's an epidemic. So statistically, methodologically, it's no less sound than any other study. So the data about people come from a national crime data set. Even the speculative part is determined using a statistical model, which relies on data from the WHO. But when this first came out, it was viewed with lots of suspicion by the visualization community, because it made us feel the main framing here is loss, is grief. And so a feminist approach here would say, actually, that's not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. In fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. And so this idea of like rebalancing emotion and reason, this is not to say that like all data visualization should be tugging on our heartstrings and like overtly propagandistic or something like that. But just to say that, you know, from a design perspective, it's worth considering why we exile emotion from the design toolbox. Okay. So I wanted to just pivot here in a second and think about, well, like, how does this relate to mapping and spatial analysis? Because one of the things I've been working on this semester, in our department, I co-teach the GIS and spatial analysis class. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how my co-instructor and I have been starting to bring in some of the principles of data feminism into the classroom and into the pedagogy that we work with here. So a little bit of context. This is Dr. Eric Huntley. They're the co-instructor with me of the class. So all this work is collaborative, shared work. This is a core class for our department. So we tend to have around 50 to 60 students when we teach it. So it's a pretty big class. Probably like some of the classes that you all are teaching, it is really a skills class. This is not a theory class. This is a class where we come to the classroom, and the goal of learning objective is that students emerge with very concrete GIS skills, that they can make maps and do a site analysis and so on and so forth. The class involves lectures, case studies, and then we have weekly labs and problem sets to kind of walk them through these skills. And so some of the main principles I'm going to talk about how we incorporated are things like examining and challenging power, and then also elevating emotion and embodiment. So as we start the class, we're kind of sort of explaining, what is a GIS, what is what are you all going to be learning here? One of the things we lead with, and then we try to kind of keep bringing back in as we keep teaching this class throughout sort of all the subject material, is that GIS is largely about, and mapping and generally sort of like about like what goes where, it is about like locating things in the world, and also locating things in the software system in these coordinates, so that we can produce maps and analysis. But then we want to add a key dimension to this what and where combination, which is we also want to add in who. So we have the what, kind of what's where, basically, or what could be where. But we also bring in who, meaning we try to ask who questions. And so this is something that Lauren and I talk about throughout the book. Again, if feminism is about power and it's about sort of challenging structural and social inequality, we have to ask questions about who. So who has historically been excluded from the land that we're mapping right now? Who is doing the analysis? Who's doing the work? What is their positionality? Where are they coming from? Who might our analysis benefit? Who might be harmed from the analysis? Who funded the work? That's always a super important question. That's a really good who question to be like always asking that one. Whose perspectives are at the table in the process of the mapping and spatial analysis? Whose are excluded? And by who, we don't just mean individuals, like individuals are important, but also social groups and institutions. Because like many times people making maps, they're not working alone. Like it's not just like one individual mapping person. We're talking about, usually in an institutional context, a regional planning context, like a city government, something like this. So a couple other things, and just like, again, like super pragmatic things that we do is, and this is all within the constraints of like, we have to teach this very skills-based class. We can't assign like 100 pages of theory a week. And so what we've done with our labs, we have these long labs that students go through each week to learn the GIS skills. And we've started inserting these little, what we call pause for reflection. So it's like, you're the student, you're doing your lab, you're click this thing and then do this, add a field, do this calculation, whatever. And then in the lab, we insert these pauses for reflection. Because often when you do those labs, you get into this kind of like rote thing, like you're a machine. And so we ask the students to just sort of pause and let's just reflect on kind of what you're doing, and also reflect on the kind of social dimension of it. So when we introduced OSM, OpenStreetMap data, we talk about how the OpenStreetMap system is overwhelmingly comprised of affluent American and European men. How does this affect what the data show, for example? And there's great research on that. We actually have them do operations sometimes in the pauses for reflection, like go look up the owner column of a certain data set that we're working with, and look for the presence of these like LLCs and trusts where they don't disclose who owns, and like think about that, like who owns your building, like why, in which way is this helpful or harmful that we might hide landlord identity, and so on and so forth. So there are these like they're basically like 2 or 3 per lab, but they're these small moments, but we ask them to reflect on just like, the social life and politics of the systems and data and concepts that they're using. And then we also do, we've been trying to do more of this actually. We try to have embodied activities. So I think GIS can be very, like one person to one computer screen, you're kind of in the software land or whatever. And so we try to do embodied learning activities, also to get some of the key concepts that I think can sometimes be a struggle for newcomers. So things like map projections. So during our week on map projections, we actually have students, we give students plastic globes and then have them cut those up. And they get to pick we have an array of projections that they can try. But here you can see this is the Berghaus star projection. And we have them try to cut them up. And in cutting them up, students start to understand, kind of what are the trade-offs, when you see that object physically, and you can see like this nice cat and star image here, you can see like the amount of smushed up area that happens here. So there's this amount of like smushiness here. This is not like a perfectly two-dimensional planar surface. You can start to see when parts of like the ocean get cut away in some projections and so on. So it kind of like brings it home in a sense. So the very kind of physical act of taking the 3D globe and then projecting it on a planar surface. And then finally, we do a lot with case studies and guest lecturers. And we have been trying to incorporate, we always pull from regional and national planning agencies. We've been trying to incorporate in the past 2 years more for folks from Black geographies, Indigenous mapping, feminist geography, data journalism, participatory mapping, and grassroots advocacy. And so an example of this that we just actually had last week, we had the folks from the Land Grab Universities project, which I just encourage everyone to check out. It's really amazing. This is a data journalism project and also a spatial database where the High Country News team looked at the Moral Act, which is the act that created all the land grant universities in the US, which is MIT is actually one of these. And it catalogs all of the land that was basically taken from Indigenous people and like given to these universities. And it's an amazing project and also an amazing data set. And it was really fantastic to hear their process because they had to actually go through a huge process of like georeferencing, working with all sorts of archival data and so on and so forth. But through these kind of case studies, what we're trying to do is also to model for learners, first of all, who uses GIS, a real variety in the kind of worlds that they come from. So it's not only like scholars, but also from practice, from planning, from advocacy worlds, from data journalism, and so on. And then also try to like really uplift and model for students really excellent uses of GIS in the service of justice. So to give them like sort of model projects to be thinking about so that when they craft their final projects, they kind of have a template to follow. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up now. So just to wrap up, these are the 7 principles of data feminism. And I think the one last point I will make is that, and you probably have noticed this from the examples that I showed, but it's that we really insist in data feminism on an expanded definition of data science, of data visualization, and really also of data scientists, like who is a data scientist? So our data science isn't defined by the size of the data set. It is also not defined by the credentials of the people undertaking the work. These are things that are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field. They're also used to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. But if we expand our definition of data science, and if what we're interested in is data science and justice, then what we can see is that some of the most exciting work at that intersection today is being undertaken by artists, journalists, humanists, community organizers, librarians, some of my favorite people, activists. And some of the work does look like traditional data science, like the, academic papers and scholarship has a huge role, I think, in challenging power and challenging inequality. But then other work is artwork. So there's like this interactive sculpture here in the middle that this is actually a sculpture that you can chat with, and is an AI that has been trained on an intergenerational dialogue of Black women in the family of the artist. Or it looks like data journalism, or it might even look like data-driven murals. And this is the work of the group Data Therapy that's local here in Boston. So we have hundreds of examples like this in the book, and we have selected these to sort of illustrate our points and inspire readers to action. Because, on the one hand, we recognize data is, part of many problems today, but at the same time, we really do feel that it can also be part of the solution. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to hearing questions and comments. Here are many ways to get in touch with myself and Lauren. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay, so there's a question. What are you hearing about new techniques for accessibility, sonification, etc.?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. I think that's such a fantastic area of research. So there's been a lot of work on data physicalization. We talk about some of that in our chapter 3, which is about elevating emotion and embodiment. Yeah, because in a lot of cases, especially for data visualization, and I see the same probably goes for maps too. It's like we really privilege the eyes. So it's like we almost, when we're designing these artifacts for 2D, we think about like the human being as like this like disembodied pair of eyeballs, and so there are ways in which privileging vision, it's like the privileging of one sense, but it's really not acknowledging like the whole, like we're these whole human beings in 3-dimensional space, and we have all these ways that we intake information and can learn and process things. And so we talk about, there's a concept called visceralization. So we talk about data visceralization, and like what are ways that we can make data more visceral, both for the purposes of accessibility, but also as this way of kind of challenging the idea that emotion has no place, like, in a way kind of like lifting all boats, giving all of us a way to engage, because there's ways in which data visualizations, even for sighted people, can be super, can be like an elite, inaccessible form of communication, depending on who your audience is. And so we talk about some art projects. We talk about, there's a fashion show where they did a data-driven garment design and then staged a fashion show out of it. And so I think like the most, so there's like some great work going on, I would say, in the information visualization community. You can probably find it by searching for physicalization and or kind of like sonification, like you said, if you're specifically interested in that. But then the other thing I would say is, like, I think some of the leading folks doing this work are actually artists. And so I think they're doing a lot of the sort of creative experimentation with data in an expanded field. So yeah, I think that, so kind of both in the academic literature, but also like look outside. Yeah, Georgia Lupi is a great person to look at.
Okay, and then another question. I really loved your book and I find myself recommending it often. What do you think are the most exciting people and projects to be watching in the next year?
Wait, I'm gonna pull up a document. Hold on. Lauren and I have this document of people we like. Actually. Okay. Romy Morrison, artist, data artist. That's one. There's a really amazing woman who's working on Black feminist AI policy. Her name is Serena Dokua Oduro. So I want to give her a shout out here. I'll paste these people's names in the chat. You all, like, I love giving shout outs to people. So it's a really good question, but it might go on forever. So she's doing super exciting work about, yeah, like Black feminist informed AI policy. Maria Rodriguez, also really amazing person to sort of follow her work. She is bringing together artificial intelligence and social work, which I just think is like a really again, it's like social work is one of these fields, like their whole field is oriented around service and around mitigating inequality and caring for people. So she's great. Oh, shout out to Cele, who's here. And who's part of the Geoticas mapping collective. Oh, and Geo Brujas, that's amazing. Just shout out to her for sure. Oh my gosh, y'all have like so many other people. For a really amazing Indigenous mapper, I would like everybody to follow the work of Margaret Pierce, who's been creating these really incredible maps of Canada with only Indigenous place names. And she's currently working on a project to what she calls to indigenize the Mississippi River. And maybe I should stop there, but I can keep going. So.
Here's a question. Do you see the practice of data feminism as something that can come from inside the house? Are there examples of data feminism projects that have been born out of traditional institutions of power? Asking as a person, and many of us, working within an institution of power.
Yeah, thanks. That's such a good question, I think. And I myself, I mean, I'm in an institution of power as well. I think there's so much we can do from these places. So, you know, I think the only like misstep happens is when we think we can do more than the folks who are working at like different scales, who are working at the grassroots or community-based level, you know, like when we kind of believed a little too much in the academic Kool-Aid or whatever that circulates in academic institutions, that we're the experts. So I think that's the misstep, but I think that's avoidable. And in fact, there's so much we can do to change our institutions from the inside. So I really believe that one can do feminist work from whatever your position. So like whether you're inside an institution and have little power, whether you're inside and have a lot of power, whether you're outside at the grassroots level, et cetera, like you do it from where you are, and it's a practice. And I think there are you know, really great examples. You know, I think like data journalism is a good example of where there've been, I think, really great projects that challenge power, but they come themselves from, you know, high-powered journalistic organizations like the New York Times and things like this. Like I would consider those very establishment type organizations. But as long as you start to engage actual, you know, kind of forces of power and inequality in your work, like that, yeah, that it can happen. So.
All right, well, we're coming right up on our time. And so I just wanted to thank you again, Catherine, so much. I think we all learned a lot, and it was really exciting to have you here as part of our forum.
Thank you all. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And please feel free to reach out, and good luck with all of your all's projects. I'm glad to know about your work as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Rachel.
It doesn't work.